Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Waynesburg Effect for the fall 2022 semester. Joining me today are our panelists Alex Hughes and Micah Leith, and I'm Tim Durkin, your host. We've got an exciting episode here for you today as we discuss the race for Pennsylvania's Senate seat between Fetterman and Oz, the legislation that Biden signed over the summer, and the buzz around the January 6th hearings. So sit back and relax. You're watching The Woo Effect. Our first segment here today, we're going to be talking about the race between Fetterman and Oz. Alex, I'm going to throw it to you first. What are your thoughts on the race right now?
So obviously, I think this is a really big race as it pertains to the Senate seat because, again, Pennsylvania is one of those swing states that you see, and this is obviously very important. And again, it's a more moderate state. They don't really swing more left or more right. They usually bounce back and forth each year. And so, of course, this was a Republican seat previously, and now you have two new guys running for this seat between Fetterman and Oz. Oz, of course, being the Republican. Fetterman on a little more on the left side. I think Oz is more moderate than Republican. So I definitely think this is, again, going to be a huge thing. I think Fetterman's stroke that he had over the summer, I think that's going to have a huge impact on what happens because, you know, he can't get out and he can't campaign as much. He has been using social media a lot as a tool for success. But again, I think it's going to be very tightly contested, and I think, obviously, unfortunately, the stroke does benefit Oz, and it's a weird thing to say, but I think it's going to be really tightly contested and a really hot battle between these two for that last seat in the Senate of Pennsylvania.
And throwing it to you, Micah?
I agree, Alex. It definitely is going to be a key race this in the midterms here again. I mean, analysts are projecting that the Senate race is going to be the Democrats' best chance to retain a Chamber of Commerce. So you can expect a lot of money from national committees, national PACs to be pouring into this race because it's going to be one of the key races in whether or not Democrats, like I said, can hold the Senate. And again, what you mentioned with the stroke, that was a big story. However, Dr. Oz kind of suffered early on in that election lead up to because he was dealing with the primary with how McCormick, his opponent, had finished. The race was too close to call, and he really wasn't able to get a good launch while Fetterman was recovering from the stroke. So I don't know that the stroke is going to play as big a role as people think, just because Dr. Oz was never really able to take advantage of it.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that. You know, he definitely has his primary that he was worried about, and again, that was a really, really close one. As I think Dr. Oz, again, he's more of a moderate Republican. We're not seeing those like Trump, or even though Donald Trump did endorse Dr. Oz, he wasn't really completely embraced by like those kind of Republicans. So again, it was really tight, and now with him going against Fetterman, he's definitely going to get those kind of Republicans on his side. But I don't know what exactly to expect. I do think it's going to be really close. I know Dr. Oz, he did say some things about Fetterman's stroke that certainly didn't help his case, because you don't want to make fun of a guy who just had a stroke, especially if you're a doctor yourself. That just seems like a weird thing to do. But at the same time, I just think that the way things are in this country right now, with Republicans and Democrats, even with that, he's definitely got to get a lot of support and definitely has a chance in the race.
It's funny you mentioned his comments about the stroke. That's kind of been a hallmark of the Oz campaign, just kind of putting his foot in his mouth in like some really inopportune times, like that video he posted on his social media where he mispronounced Redner's, and just a bizarre campaign that tried to deal with inflation, but just kind of became nothing but campaign material for Fetterman. So that's a really interesting point to consider.
Yeah, so Alex, you mentioned earlier how Fetterman honestly benefited from the use of social media since he wasn't able to get out there and campaign. So Micah, I want to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think social media plays in this?
Well, I think Fetterman, during his analysis of what the conditions were leading into this election, he saw that for a progressive, more leftward candidate to win, he has to turn out young people. So a focus on social media is really focused on getting as many young people to the ballot box as possible. And again, that's really been where you've seen his most aggressive attacks. Again, he's done some things that might feel gimmicky, but in the age of the internet meme, it plays extremely well, where he's calling Dr. Oz someone from New Jersey that doesn't know anything about Pennsylvania. I mean, again, Oz protests that Pennsylvanians don't really care about where someone's from, but as someone who's lived in Pennsylvania most of his life, I can tell you that Pennsylvanians are very anti-New Jersey. So things like that have really had an impact. So the social media side has been a critical part of his campaign, and we're going to have to wait and see for exit polls to come back, just how important that was in getting the young voters out to the ballot box to vote for him.
Yeah, so we've all seen on YouTube, we even talked about it in last semester's episode that dealt with Oz. We've all seen the ads. Alex, I'm throwing it to you. What do you think of them? Are they too far? Are they not far enough? But what are your thoughts?
See, for me, I don't know. I don't think that they're too far. I don't think that they're not far enough. I think with like politics, I don't think you really can go too far. I mean, you can go too far, but it's really hard to like go too far, because in the end of the day, each one is trying to dig up as much dirt as possible on your opponent, because you're trying to make your opponent look as bad as possible, because you want them to look like the worst person ever, because you want all the votes, you want to win. So I think as long as you're like not going to like certain places, I think you're perfectly fine.
Yep. And Micah, I'll throw the same question to you.
Well, the ads have really been a big part of this race, and it comes as the National Republican Senate Committee is starting to run into money problems. Not that they're going to go bankrupt, but they don't have as much cash on hand to pump into TV ads as they'd like. So having a candidate like Oz that can use his own money to push TV ads as much as possible, that's really going to be a big key in this race, and it's going to help him more than, say, a Republican that doesn't have that sort of personal cash that they can donate to their campaign. So it's definitely gonna play a big role in the race. But the question is, I think that Fetterman is expecting to get a lot of the young turnout, while Dr. Oz is more focused on pushing the older turnout to his TV ads. But again, like we said, the YouTube ads, that's a way that Oz is really focusing on younger people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's time for the most important question. Alex, I'll ask you first. Who's gonna win?
You know, I'm going to have to go with Dr. Oz. I know a lot of people have been saying, oh, he's in New Jersey and he's this and he's that. But I think at the end of the day, he had a quote that struck out to me. And I know you kind of mentioned it earlier, but he said, people don't really care where I'm from. And I know that, again, Pennsylvanians do care, but I think I think he has just enough. And I think he's going to narrowly win this seat.
All right, and Micah, who do you think is going to win?
I do think it's going to be a close race, but right now, just looking at the polling data we have, Fetterman has an 8% lead in the polls. Now, obviously, that's not indicative of anything if 2016 showed us anything, but with an 8-point lead, that's significant. And while I don't think Fetterman's going to carry the election with 8 points, but I can see a scenario where Fetterman wins that election by 5%. So my money's on Fetterman right now, unless a significant development happens as we approach November.
All right, well, we have some conflicting opinions here on the Waynesburg effect, but that's all the time we have for this segment. Next segment, we'll be talking about the Biden administration and the legislation that they've been passing this summer. Don't go anywhere, you're watching the Waynesburg effect.
You're watching WCTV, where we aim to bring you the best local coverage of what you care about most. Everything from local businesses to hometown sports and the latest weather. We're keeping up to date with what you need to know about issues that affect our campus and our community. We're telling the stories that matter, celebrating our past, our future, and our potential. So tune in for all the latest buzz right here on WCTV Channel 14, Waynesburg.
Welcome back to the Waynesburg effect. This segment, we're going to be talking about the busy summer that the Biden administration had. So Micah, I'm going to throw it to you first. What are some of the highlights of this summer?
Well, Tim, this summer comes after a slow start to the Biden administration. Over the past 2 years, it's kind of felt like President Biden has really had to fight just to get really any sort of legislation passed. But over the summer, we saw some things open up in Congress, some compromises made between Democrats and Republicans on the Hill, especially in the Senate, where a lot of legislation has died over the past, not even the past 2 years, over the past 8 to 12 years, as the Senate has been really sort of divided. So over the summer, President Biden signed the CHIPS bill into law, which invests money into semiconductor chip manufacturing to help compete with China. He passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which mainly is aimed to reduce inflation, although it did include several other things in that package. And then one thing that got people talking was student loan debt cancellation. That's for many people making under a certain amount of money, $10,000 of their student loans were going to be forgiven. And that's probably been one of the biggest talking points from the summer. Just that's something that President Biden campaigned on, and something that people, especially in the leftward wing of his party, were really pushing hard for. And as we get closer to the midterm elections, it's going to be interesting seeing just how much, obviously that decision, but also the other ones that I mentioned, play as we get closer to that election.
Yeah, so you mentioned the student debt situation, which he did promise in his original campaign, and after a little bit of time, it did get here. And it is a huge talking point, but maybe not in the way that we thought, because we see people against it, and then people are saying that it wasn't enough. So Alex, I'm curious, where do you fall on that?
So even though I am a college student, I ultimately fall against it because, I mean, for me, you have like guys who are going to college and they end up being doctors and all that kind of thing, and they make a whole lot of money. And I just feel like for us, we're going to college, we're taking out these loans to go to college. I just feel like it's our responsibility to just pay them back after we're done. And I mean, I know it's probably not a very popular opinion amongst college students. I mean, I have a lot of these college loans myself, but at the end of the day, I just feel like I took the responsibility, I took out the loan, so I should have to repay it back. That's just where I fall.
All right, and Micah, I know you have a different opinion.
Well, I mean, I think that the responsibility point is important, and it's a discussion that we have to make, but ultimately I think that this decision came down to two ones. One, obviously the political concern, like Tim said, that even people that are in the leftward wing of his party are saying that it wasn't enough. That just goes to show you how hard people in his party have been pushing. So there were definitely political considerations made in making that decision. But I also think that the larger economic condition of the country played a role. 46 million people have student loan debt. And at some point, you have to start to consider how much that debt is playing on impacting the growth of the economy. The discussion in the lead up to this decision has been, if you forgive all or even just a portion of that, that's going to free up a certain amount of income for, again, those 46 million people. And I think one consideration that has been made is how much that extra money going into the economy that used to be going to the federal government for student loan debt, how much is that going to impact and boost the economy as we're seeing some slowdowns, especially with inflation rising significantly over the past few years.
Moving on from student loan debt, Alex, what are some of the highlights, and then which ones do you think are going to be most effective?
I like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that he passed over the summer. Again, I'm not the biggest Biden guy. I'm very vocal about that. But I do think that was a pretty good act, trying to get some more jobs and keep jobs in America. And again, just putting that workforce back in, because that's something that's been instilled in America for a long time that's kind of been dissipating a lot lately. There's that like American work ethic and vibe right there. And then as far as some other things, I'm not a huge fan of the Inflation Reduction Act, because just looking at it, I just don't know if it's going to do what it's intended to do. I don't see it reducing the inflation. Again, we've had gas prices have been starting to go lower, but at the same time, I just think that's a natural thing where it rises and drops. So again, I'm not a huge supporter of the Inflation Reduction Act, because I just feel like it's kind of counter to what it's meant to do.
Yeah, I mean, any bill that deals with the economy, it's going to be a slow start, and so we'll just have to wait and see on that. Micah, which bills do you think are going to be the most effective?
Well, for me, one of the biggest ones that didn't get as much press as, say, the student loans being forgiven or something like the Inflation Reduction Act is a CHIPS bill, which was aimed, like I said, to boost semiconductor chip manufacturing in the United States. And I think that's going to be a big, important factor moving forward as the American economy continues to try to compete with China for that share of the global market in advanced electronics and preparing for the future in cities. Another thing that I really think is important that wasn't necessarily over the summer, but throughout Biden's administration to the state is how many federal judges he's appointed. One thing that people really identified in President Trump's administration as being a key thing that President Trump did well is appointing a lot of federal judges, which reimagined the judicial system in America. Biden has done the same thing. In fact, Biden has appointed more federal judges than any other president to this point in his presidency. Now, we saw President Trump appoint a lot more in the back half of his presidency, but that's really a key thing, especially looking years after he's out of office. Those judges are still going to be on the bench making decisions and influencing the national discussion. So that's one thing that I think is important. And again, I'm going to have to shockingly agree with Alex on this. Is the Inflation Reduction Act is one that I'm not completely sold on. For what you said, it's bills that affect the American economy can be interesting in a lot of ways. You're playing with live wires there. Even just passing the bill can have an impact on the economy and the financial sector. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not that's a positive or a negative thing for the country. I'm not quite as far as you are in thinking that it's completely negative, but it is still a question mark for sure.
So real quick here, I'm just going to ask the big question. I'll pass it to you first, Alex, and we'll go to Micah. Do you think that this has improved Biden's chances in midterms?
No, I do not. I just don't think that it's going to. I think just the stuff that we saw previously from Biden, I think it's just too far gone for him. It was just really bad start, and I just don't know what he could possibly do to save himself from what he started in the past. Again, I'm not trying to sound like a homer, but at the same time, I just don't know that I just don't see it happening for him.
Mm-hmm. And Micah?
Well, I don't have quite as dismal a look as you do, but I do generally agree that Biden, before the summer, his approval rating has been sliding. He's really not been super popular, even within his own party, which is a warning sign for voter interest in the midterms where lesser-known candidates are on the ballot. And if people aren't happy with the president, they're probably not likely to come out and support the president's candidates in Congress and even in local races. However, I do think this summer was really key in helping build up some of that momentum. And we saw over the summer how the race to control the House got slimmer. The Senate race is now a toss-up. So I think there was good movement. I don't think Biden and the Democratic Party has been saved just yet, but things like the student loan debt forgiveness, that's going to play a big role in energizing, especially younger voters. And just having things on the resume to be able to point to in campaign ads, that really helped out a lot of, especially in the House, representatives in tight races to be able to point to specific pieces of legislation that they voted for and Biden signed. So it definitely boosted those candidates on the midterm ballot. But again, like Alex said, is it too late? That's to determine. Right now, it doesn't look great for Democrats, especially in the House. But I think that the summer definitely helped.
Thank you, Micah. On the next segment, we're going to be talking about the January 6th hearings and some of the evidence that was discovered from them. Don't go anywhere. You're watching the Waynesburg Effect. Welcome back to the Woo Effect. This segment, we're going to be talking about the January 6th hearings and what was discovered from them. Micah, I'm going to throw it to you first. What are some of the highlights from the summer?
Well, Tim, this is the one thing that really kind of dominated the summer, especially when TV, even in some primetime slots, was just the January 6th committee televising these hearings and trying to get that information that they gathered through the investigations in front of the American people as much as possible. And we heard testimony from all kinds of people involved, Capitol police officers, we heard from campaign staff, we heard from people that were very close to former President Trump while he was in office around that point. But probably, again, we got some bombshell testimony, and some of that led to the search and seizure of documents at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence. Again, that warrant came from that investigation into the January 6th committee. But maybe the biggest thing wasn't what was said, but what was the American people's response to it. There really wasn't the overwhelming interest and change of opinion that I think the committee was expecting. It was nothing like, just going back 50 years to Watergate under President Nixon. There wasn't like that sort of organic interest that people were really interested in. It changed their opinion of the presidency. So I think that was probably the biggest takeaway from the summer.
So, Alex, you're an American citizen.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on this? Did they change at all, or are they the same?
My thoughts have not changed on this at all. I just think that this is nothing more than another attempt by the Democrats at making former President Donald Trump look bad. We've seen it a lot of times where they've just been looking for anything and everything to get something on him. We've seen it with Mar-a-Lago, January 6th. They've already tried to impeach him twice. So I have not changed my thoughts on it at all. I still feel the same way. I think that they're really trying to push this as something huge, and they want, like Micah said, they really want it to be remembered like something like Watergate. But I think, honestly, looking back, I don't think it's going to be looked at like that, and I don't think the Americans are taking it like that at all.
So considering that kind of ambivalent response, Micah, you mentioned sort of the social media, TV angle of it. Do you think they're going to start scaling back on that?
Well, I think so, because they haven't gotten the results they've wanted to. And again, some of these hearings were held during the primetime block of broadcast news and broadcast television. That isn't easy to do. That takes a lot of negotiation with networks to be able to get that televised, because again, that's the bread and butter for TV networks. That's when they make a lot of their money. So I would expect to see fewer, maybe if they hold any more, maybe one or two more televised hearings during that primetime block. Now, it wouldn't shock me if they continue to hold them during the day, but I do think it might scale back a little bit just because they aren't accomplishing what they need to. And also because the investigation is kind of moving away from the hearing segment and more to reviewing documents and exploring that sort of thing. So I do think the investigation is changing, but for more ways than just the American people don't care, because, I do think that there obviously was some political interest in this, but I think overall that the main goal was to get to the bottom of this, because what happened to the Capitol, no matter whose fault it was, that was a significant point in American history, and it really impacted the political climate in the country and even just the security of the Capitol. So while there is, like Alex said, there is some political interest to play, I don't think that largely that is the main reason. I do think that the investigation is motivated by a genuine interest in getting to the bottom of the facts and figuring out who is responsible for that incident at the Capitol.
So even if it isn't for political gain, like you say, do you think that this might benefit Biden in midterms if something does come out?
Well, a lot of things have come out, just nothing that really people could say is a smoking gun, the thing that would finish President Trump. And again, throughout President Trump's campaign and presidency, there's been a lot of things that people thought would put the nail in the coffin, but just hasn't. But to date, it really hasn't impacted how people feel about President Trump and January 6th itself. Like, the partisan polls, Democrats still tend to favor the committee and think that President Trump was at fault. Republicans still think that President Trump was not at fault and are not interested in the findings of the committee. And independents, the numbers really haven't changed. It's still relatively split, skewing more towards supporting the January 6th committee. So politically, I don't know if it's helping the Democrats in the midterms. I just don't think that it's having any impact at all, is really been my takeaway from looking at the polls as a result of it.
Okay, Alex, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with that point you made at the end there, where I don't think it's changed any opinions on anything. I think Democrats already feel one way and they're going to stay with that way. I think Republicans feel one way and they're going to stay with that way, and they're going to vote for who they want to, and Republicans are going to vote for who they want to. But another thing that I did find interesting was a lot of the Republicans that were involved in this hearings, few of them got primaried and got taken out. And I did find that extremely interesting, as Republicans a lot of them have really liked Donald Trump, and they look to stay with him. And when you have these people who are going against him, and they voted a lot of them out. So I did find that really interesting, actually.
Well, that like you said, that is interesting, watching those especially in the House, those candidates where were losing, who were involved, whether they voted to impeach President Trump after the incident at the Capitol or after the hearings themselves. That is interesting, but at the same time, leadership in the Republican Party has been trying to distance itself from President Trump, especially in the Senate with Mitch McConnell really even criticizing some of the pro-Trump candidates. So I just don't know how much of an impact this is playing, because in the House, some of those bigger personalities that can't associate with Trump, they matter more in the House. In the Senate, again, Mitch McConnell said this, that candidate quality matters. Having a really strong candidate that doesn't have a lot of controversy, that's more important in the Senate. So I see those primaries more as a function of how the House operate and how those elections work, rather than the American people's views on the committee.
Well, thank you, Micah. Thank you, Alex. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. Thank you for tuning in, and be sure to check out our future episodes on the WCTV YouTube channel. With that, thank you for watching the very first episode of The Waynesburg Effect.
This has been a production of Waynesburg Community Television.